It's all right. Good morning, everybody. How are y'all doing? It's very nice to see you all this morning. Thank you for joining us. I was a little bit worried I'd be talking to an empty hall, but thank you for joining us. So my name is Jay Smith. I'm an information service librarian here at the Abilene Public Library, and today we're going to be kicking off hopefully a long-running series called Preservation for Non-Professionals. Part of the idea is that you don't have to be fully credentialed preservation specialist, conservationist to have some of the basic knowledge to keep your stuff around for as long as possible and to safeguard it from some of the big pain points that you're going to run into. Fire, water, mold, pests, all that kind of stuff. So who am I? Well, who are any of us really? Well, my name is Jay Smith. I'm an Abilene native. I graduated from Cooper High School back in 2002. I got my master's degree in library science from the University of North Texas in 2009. My specialty there was in rare books and special collections. So I'm going to be talking to you from kind of a unique perspective in the sense that I have some of this knowledge. I used to do some of this at the university level, but I've never been a professional conservator. I'm not a professional conservator, and I'm not your professional conservator. Basically, we're going to be going over some of the basics, but when it comes to the real meat and potatoes of your particular item, if there's some unique problem that you're running into, we're going to have to sort of go on a treasure hunt to find more specific stuff to you. Since 2012 or so, I've been an academic and public librarian in Houston, Texas. Most recently, I was at the Harris County Public Library System in Tomball, Texas. That was a joint public and academic library. So I had a kind of a weird experience with both students and the public. And I've only been with the Abilene Public Library since April of this year. So I'm relatively new, but I'm glad to be back in my hometown. I used to come to story times here as a kid, so it's great to be back on a professional level. I became a librarian to get away from two things, technology and public speaking, and it's not working out very well for either of those.
There he is.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, ladies. Okay. So, basic introduction, why preservation matters. This is kind of how we're going to start. Kind of a basic overview of what it means to really care about preservation. What does it mean to really want to safeguard your things for the future, and you know why that's important to us, not just as individuals, but as a culture, as a society, part of our heritage as well. Then I'm going to give just briefly some of the professional context where professional conservators and professional preservationists work. Kind of the things that they run into. And then we're going to look at some of the major risk factors. This is going to be the stuff that any collection, whether it's on a university, museum level, or just in your home, this is the same kind of stuff that you're going to run into over and over and over again. So we're going to talk about what those are and some of the solutions and preventative measures that you can take when it comes to those things. We're also going to touch a little bit on emergency preparedness, because even though, you know, just the time factor, things are going to degrade over time, you sometimes run into those big events, fire, flood, some of those major events, and a little preparation goes a long way when it comes to emergency preparedness and dealing with the aftermath of one of those things. And then at the end, I'll try to answer whatever questions you have, and then I would like to get your input. Because this is the first session, and I hope will be a long-running series, I've got some ideas about some topics I want to cover, but I want to hear from you guys. You have your own collections, you have your own things that you're working with your own collections, and I want to hear what you think we should focus on, and those are the directions that we'll take in the future. Okay. So why should we care? Why does preservation matter at all? Well, there's personal interest. Things that you collect, things that are important to you on a personal level, those just have intrinsic value to you. And that's, you know, that's number one when it comes to this stuff. Even if you're not personally connected to it, you might have a personal interest, whether it's, oh, I collect coins, or I collect Civil War maps, or, you know, whatever it is. Your personal interest really is a driving factor when it comes to caring about preserving these kind of materials. It's also to avoid cultural amnesia. I think somebody described the time we're living in now as a memory hole. Things get hyped up really big in terms of like the newest Netflix show or the newest best-selling book, and it seems like it's everywhere for 2 weeks and then it disappears into the ether. And so preservation and caring about the longevity of things is a way to safeguard against things just getting lost in the shuffle as time goes on. Of course, things can have historical significance. You hear every once in a while about somebody discovering a connection to a famous figure. They discover some documents in an attic or something like that that connects them to something significant, whether they have a relative's World War II memorabilia or we had a gentleman that came into the University of North Texas Rare Book Room that had, he was an African-American guy, and he had his family's slave deed that hit the deed to his families when they were bought and sold in the slave trade. And it's, right, personal interest, cultural amnesia, historical significance, kind of all bound up in something that's got some really heavy emotional impact. But those things are important to preserve as well. They tell us the story of who we are. You know, we kind of understand who we are in the world based on where we've come from. And if we start losing things bit by bit, we kind of lose a part of who we understand ourselves to be today. And of course, it's to preserve access to these things for the future. Kind of going back to the cultural amnesia thing, these things need to be around for people to access in the future so they don't get lost to time. So this is an example of things that probably look pretty typical. You might have some of these things in your own collection. One of our patrons, David Olson, brought in a book of his with the fantastic title of Svenskarn I Texas I ord och bild, which is fantastic. I love that title. Swedes in Texas in Word and Pictures, 1835 to 1918. This was published in 1919. Not a particularly old book in terms of age, but it's got the kind of wear and tear that you're going to see everywhere, right? So it's the torn spine, the hinge is broken, the glue, it's a little hard to tell, but you can tell the glue has dried out and started to crack a little bit. It's got some paper damage. Luckily no mold, it just looks like a little water damage. Luckily the text block is intact, so we won't have to do any sort of rebinding or anything like that. But these are family histories and pictures of Swedish immigrants to Texas, and his own family is in here. Very, very important book to him, and also for the history of Texas and history of immigration in this country. And he brought it in just to, for me to see. It was very nice of him to bring it in. But this is the kind of stuff that's not a spectacular amount of damage, but pretty normal when it comes to people's collections. Yes, ma'am?
Should you have something like that rebound like at Chapman's or something?
Yes, they can do that. Luckily, what I was saying before is because the text block itself is intact, you're not looking at like a major rebinding job. It's more just getting the end paper here reconnected, so it's...
But Chapman's can do something like that?
I believe so, yes, ma'am. Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so a little bit of the professional context. Most professional conservators and professional preservation specialists are, not surprisingly, at universities and museums. That's where major collections are, and that's where you run into items with major damage that need to be really well taken care of. Some peculiarities or specific things about professional preservation specialists. They're responsible for an entire collection, so they're not going to be just working on one book that you bring in and say, can you help me with this? No, they're responsible for the entirety of that collection, not just older materials, but also incoming materials too, because if a university is going to spend X amount of money on this year's acquisitions, they want to make sure they get the most that they can out of that. They also support exhibits, so museums specifically, but also universities as well. Next time you go to an art museum or an exhibit of some kind, while you're looking at the actual items, be sure to pay attention a little bit to how they're mounted. So the framing and the backboards on artwork, or how an artifact is presented on a table or something like that. Conservators and preservation specialists, they weigh in a lot on those, because you could run into a lot of danger if you don't mount and present those things correctly. My wife hates it when we go to art museums because she wants to look at the art, and I'm saying, look how clever it is that they mounted this in a certain way. Look how safe it is. And she's like, shut up, just look at the art. They're also responsible for emergency management. We'll get into that a little bit later, but university and museum collections are just as susceptible to major disasters as anybody else, and these departments are responsible for the cleanup and the dealing with the aftermath of one of those things. When I was at the University of North Texas, we had a water main leak in our rare book room, and we had a runaway mold outbreak. And so for the next year, it was emergency management of how do we protect our collection and the rest of the collection as well. It was not a fun summer, but we did it. But that kind of thing, they're responsible for. Sometimes you will find a university, especially universities, they will do public consultations. So if you bring in an item and you want some input on how best to treat it or how to deal with it, sometimes you'll run into departments that will do that, but they're more than likely not going to actually do the work for you. Their responsibility is their own collection, not the public's, unfortunately. Their techniques are both, I put both sophisticated and simple. This is one of the things we're going to get into when we get into some of the more specifics. Although the equipment and the techniques that these professionals use are very sophisticated, and they really get into the chemical processes of things and the specifics about what this paper is made of versus this ink made of, and those kind of things. At the end of the day, their techniques for preservation are pretty simple, and the things that we're going to be getting into, you might be surprised at how simple they are, but the kind of things that we're going to be talking about are exactly the kind of things that these folks use. So general principles of preservation. One of the things that is really, really important when you're talking about rebinding a book or restoring a piece of art or putting a statue back together or repairing an antique toy or restoring a photograph, whatever it is, one of the key principles is non-permanence. You don't want to do anything to any item that can't be reversed later on, because the best practice today may not be the best practice in the future. So a type of glue that we use to repair a book today, in 10, 15, 100 years, we might discover that it's not quite as safe or inert as we thought it was. And if you can't undo those things, you've basically doomed that book for the future. Same thing with binding. If you bind something and you think you've got a just perfect, historically accurate type of binding, and then you discover it's not, it needs to be reversible. So a lot of the techniques that conservators use are not necessarily to get everything 100% locked in place, perfect. It's more just to stabilize it for the future if we need to tweak it later on. Prevention is the #1 tool, both for professional collections and for your own collections. It's a lot easier to prevent major damage than it is to repair major damage. If you've ever dealt with things that are just crumbling in your hands, that's why it's easier to fix the problem at the beginning than try to fix it later on. The idea of content versus container, this is something that's a little more set in the world of rare books, and hopefully in future sessions we can go into this a little more detailed, but I wanted to put it out here just for y'all to think about. So the idea of content versus container is what's really important. What are you really trying to preserve? Is it the information in the object, or is it the object itself that's important? In most cases, it's both, right? The book itself is important as well as the text. The image is as important and as well as the actual photograph. But it's not always the case. A good example of this is the Gutenberg Bible. If I want to read a passage in the Bible, I don't need to use the Gutenberg Bible because the content has been copied and formatted in ways that are more accessible and easier for me to read. But the Gutenberg Bible is important as an object in itself. So just something to think about as in future sessions when we get into this more. We'll see how this kind of gets complicated for sure. Okay, well that's all well and good. What about my stuff? What are we actually talking about? Well, we're pretty much talking about everything. So these are some of the typical things you'll see in anybody's collection, right? Paper documents, books, photographs, artwork, artifacts of any kind, AV materials, and also digital materials as well, because those increasingly nowadays are what people are collecting and formats that people are saving things in as digital formats. But you might also run into some weird stuff too, right? Shoes, Boy Scout badges. I have a 7-year-old at home, so most of my house is filled with Legos. So how do you preserve Legos? I don't know. I may have to figure that out one day. Collections are made up of a lot of different things, and there's not a one-size-fits-all when it comes to a collection. I used to do some repair work in Highland Park in Dallas for a gentleman who is a multi-billionaire. He owns about half of Fort Worth. And he likes to collect Imperial Russian Fabergé eggs. So, not what you're going to find typically in a collection, but maybe, I don't know. So what does your collection look like? Y'all tell me, what is the main thing that y'all have that you're concerned about or might be something that you want to pay attention to in the future? Yes, ma'am.
I have 49 of the 50 Harvard classics.
Okay.
My great uncle wrote his name in 1907 in each one of them, and they're getting dry. I'm being very careful that the morning sun doesn't dry them up.
All good stuff. All good stuff. Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you. Who else? What do y'all have?
Heavens, I have letters, boxes. I don't think my mother threw away any letters she received. I mean, I got boxes of them, and I have them all the way back to, gosh, the 1800s. Mm-hmm. And they're fascinating reading. They're still in the envelopes and stuff, and still in the boxes, but that's my next project.
Okay.
Others. But, you know, how to preserve something like that.
Right.
And my first thought is, you know, put them in acid-free sleeves and put them in chronological order.
Right.
I mean, in a binder.
Mm-hmm.
I guess if they, now, some people will photograph them and put them on your phone. Well, then what happens to them?
Not a bad step, but one step in many, for sure. Yeah.
What do you do with them on your phone?
Right.
You crater and your phone disappears. You got to have something.
Yeah, even something as simple, not simple, I shouldn't say that, but something as, well, I just have a letter, how do I do it? Something simple as just a letter or a photograph or something, when you start thinking down the line of how I'm going to do this, what do I do next? What do I do next? What does this mean if I preserve it in a certain way? It can get tricky. So, yes, ma'am.
Family photos and home movies.
Okay, there you go. What format of the movies, if you don't mind my asking?
8mm.
8mm. Excellent. Excellent.
And flash drives.
Yeah. So, yeah, like I said, a lot of different things, each with its own unique problem. No two collections are going to be alike. I mentioned the billionaire that I used to do a little bit of work for. He was a sucker for Americana, anything American. He had General MacArthur's helmet and Abraham Lincoln's Senate seat and a piece of the Titanic and crazy stuff, just unbelievable stuff, because he had more money than he knew what to do with. He had a personal librarian. There's only 2 personal librarians in the US that I'm aware of, and he had one of them. And this guy was running ragged trying to how to preserve all these things, because one day he would buy a piece of the Titanic and then the next week he would buy Adolf Hitler's personal library. So he's running on from one end to the other trying to figure out how to save these things. I don't envy him his job, even though that would be really amazing. Okay, so some of the more specific stuff that you're going to run into. So temperature and humidity, along with water damage and mold, are probably the biggest heavy hitters when it comes to damage of items. Temperature, not surprisingly, is a killer of books, absolutely. Of course, too high temperature means it's on fire, and so that's not good. High temperatures also are very much related to relative humidity, because higher temperature air can hold more moisture, which means more mold, more rot, and more degradation for things like leather, glue, cloth. But also too low of a temperature will actually dry out the paper. So if you've ever held paper that looks like it's almost about to crumble in your hands, it's because probably it was stored at too low a temperature at one point and it pulled all the moisture out of the paper. So related to temperature, relative humidity, this gets into the weird world of physics, which I'm not an expert in at all, but essentially temperature has an effect on how much moisture the air can hold at any given time. So the upshot is higher temperature, more potential for moisture in the air, more mold issues, and more decay. This was an uphill battle in Houston, Texas, as you can imagine, with the humidity off the charts. We ran dehumidifiers pretty much nonstop to keep our stuff intact. This is even more of a problem when you have universities and museums in places like South America, where it essentially rains every hour on the hour or something like that. So definitely a slow killer of books and other materials as well. So ideal conditions for storage, anywhere between 60 and 65 degrees Fahrenheit and 30 to 40% relative humidity. Now we're going to talk in a little bit about stability really is the key, not perfection. So don't go home and think like, I've got to get my home, you know, Jay Smith said to get my home to 62.7 degrees and blah, blah, blah. No. Stability is a lot more important than getting it absolutely perfect when it comes to these numbers. So as you can imagine, basements and attics are really the worst places to store things because they tend to be hotter, colder, wetter, or drier than any other place in your house. And another simple solution is to keep your windows sealed. We probably do that already, but in the winter months when you discover that one door that doesn't quite fit in its hinges just perfectly and you've got a huge draft, easy to overlook some basic things like this that can introduce kind of an X factor into the environment of your home. Storing items in a separate area, which most people probably do already, closets, or if you have a home library, separate areas are a lot easier to control than if you just have them out in the open. So instead of trying to control your entire house because your home library is in there, you only have to control a very small area with these things. And of course, humidifiers and dehumidifiers, depending on the situation. Of course, in Abilene, Texas, it's going to be different than Houston, Texas versus, you know, Wyoming, you know, that kind of thing. So those are good tools depending on your needs. This is another common mistake that people make when they have collections like these is in the winter months, they get chilly, they want to crank up the heat, and they feel nice and warm and toasty, and it's great. But their books and artwork and photographs are going, no, please don't do this. Consider keeping the thermostat a little bit on the lower end. Don't freeze, but don't crank it up to 11 when it comes to winter heat. And as I said before, please don't feel like you have to get these things within half a degree or whatever. It's important to try to hit these things, certainly, but don't get caught up in trying to get it perfect. Collections suffer the most damage when you have sudden changes in these things, right? Spikes in temperature, spikes in moisture, things like that. So stability is a lot more important than being perfect on these things. So light damage, this is something that's also very, very common. All light is damaging, no matter what the source. Sometimes you'll see, especially LED lights being marketed as completely safe and all that kind of stuff. It's not true. All light is damaging, just to different degrees. UV is the most damaging. Of course, that's sunlight. If you've ever had a bookshelf near a window, you've seen this a million times. It is cumulative, so it's not like you can have a little bit of damage and then move it to another place and then slowly over time it gets better. No, it's just going to get worse and worse once it starts. And it is irreversible too. There is no way to get the pigment or the dye back on leather, paper, ink, anything like that once it starts down that road. Light damage is, of course, combination of intensity and duration. Most of what you're going to see when it comes to what we're talking about in the world of preservation is duration. And basically what it's going to do, it's going to just slowly break down all of those materials. You'll start to see the fading, of course, you can see discoloration, and it will also dry out paper. We talked about temperature a moment ago. Very common. Yeah, so use curtains. So before we get into the solutions, let me just show you. So these are the Abraham tapestries from Hampton Court in London. This was King Henry VIII's palace. It tells the story of Abraham in, I think it's 8 giant tapestries that line the Great Hall. I was able to see these in person. They are amazing to look at for sure. But if you can see, I know it's a little hard to tell, not huge resolution here, but you can tell that it's almost been bleached. There is still color in there, but this is not what it looked like when it was first created. It was much more vibrant. But it was stored in a great hall with giant windows. And so over several hundred years, that's what happens. Right now, you can't really tell in this photo, but right now they are covered by glass panes that block UV light. So that's why they can be displayed like that, and it's going to slow the rate of discoloration immensely. But it's just a good example of not too much intense light, but just over hundreds of years, the duration really took its toll on this pretty amazing piece of artwork. Solutions are very simple, right? Use curtains and blinds, easy, easy. Be careful where you hang artwork. This is something that I'm guilty of. I'll just put a poster or a shelf of books somewhere that I think looks good, and then a week later I'm like, wait a minute, they're getting scorched. So I'm guilty of this big time. Fluorescent lights, of course, are pretty rough on items as well. Like I said before, LEDs are probably the best option, but they're not 100% safe either. And then, of course, anything that's in a permanent position like these tapestries, those are the ones that are going to get hit the hardest on these things. So rotating collections, rotating items is a great practice regardless. And then, if at all possible, copies are great to display and keep the originals safer. Okay. So sorry for the disgusting photos, but these are some of the bad risk factors when it comes to items as well. So dirt and dust, very common. This is something, especially if things are in long-term storage, dust will pile up. Dirt and dust isn't just dirt and dust. It's basically dismantled sandpaper. If you ever looked at dirt or dust under the microscope, it looks like razor blades. And that's what it's going to act like when it comes in contact with photographs, especially with photographs. And also the individual particles themselves can really, really be acidic. So they get into the cracks and the crevices of an item, and you know, they're there and they're going to start working their damage from the inside out, essentially. And of course they attract pests. Pests are probably second only to, you know, fire and water damage and mold when it comes to damage to items. They're absolutely devastating. And they're devastating because they love to eat books, especially older books. They're organic, right? They're leather. The glue is organic. The cloth is organic. that's what they want. They want places to live and they want food to eat, and unfortunately things we're trying to save is what they want to eat. So the big ones: cockroaches, silverfish, termites, beetles, and of course rats and mice as well. Bookworms are real. There's not a real thing called a bookworm. They're just basically anything and everything that looks like a worm and eats books. This is a book louse, silverfish, rat, mouse. I forget what this is. It's a larva of a particular beetle, but all of these things, they love books. They love to chew on them. Here's some of the worst examples I could find. This one up here was attacked by a rat. You can tell just over time it started shaking chunks out of it. You can see a few little holes in here of bookworms as well. In the top right we have termites. Termites of course love anything wood related, and that would be paper and boards of books. Also down here some termite damage in a frame of a piece of art. And then bookworm down in the middle. I'm not sure what kind of larva it was, but essentially something laid its eggs on the book and started having lunch. So these things are pernicious and will really, really wreak havoc on a collection. All right, so what can you do? So pretty simple stuff as well, right? Don't keep your garbage in the house. It's going to attract pets. Try to get it as far away. If you're storing things in a separate area, it's probably not going to be as much of an issue, but the less you can attract into your house, the better. Of course, sealing the doors and windows, you probably should be doing anyway for temperature control, but this will help keep pests out as well. This was interesting. If anybody has any stacks of cardboard in their garage or attic or anything, that might be a good idea to get rid of that. Supposedly, this is like a magnet to rats and mice and things like that. I didn't know that, but apparently so. Of course, food and drink is a no-no when it comes to any collections. That's pretty standard practice across the board in libraries and museums. Indoor plants are great. I love having indoor plants, but they also attract what you don't want in your collection. So if you have indoor plants, try to keep them at a distance from your collection as well. Museums and libraries like to use heat and cold to kill insects. They'll crank up the heat really hard for a day or two just to try to kill out anything. Same way they'll crank the heat way down to try to kill insects. But of course, heat and cold are damaging to the items as well. So if you go this route, be careful. Right, so when I was doing some research, I came across this Biblioteca Joanina in Coimbra, Portugal. They use bats as a form of pest control. Because of the high vaulted ceilings, bats are going to be in there regardless, and they figure, well, they eat the insects, so we'll just leave them be. And they just clean up the poop every morning. Probably not the route I would go, given the choice, but hey, you know,
Exterminator.
Huh?
An exterminator.
Yep, that's an option as well.
I mean, their chemicals won't hurt your collection.
It's unlikely, depending on how you store it. So if you've got your rare materials just on a bookshelf where he's going to be spraying or going to be moving around, that's probably something I wouldn't recommend. But if you've got them off in a closet somewhere, if you've got them someplace that's going to be removed from where they're going to be working, I think that's a good option. Okay, water and mold. So again, one of the big heavy hitters. Water damage is especially harmful to glossy or coated paper. If you've ever got a magazine wet, it basically turns into cement and the magazine's done. Regular paper is not so bad with that, but still very, very damaging. Water is primarily dangerous in the sense of promoting mold growth. Water damage is one of those things that it's discoloring and it warps the paper, but it's not the end game when it comes to an item. However, once mold gets introduced into the equation, it starts to get really bad really quickly. Mold, of course, wants to eat the books just like any other pest, and it needs moisture and a food source. Absolutely irreversible damage. Mold is one of the worst things that can be introduced into a collection because it will eat through things. And as an added bonus, it can be really, really harmful to humans as well. So usually when it comes to big mold treatment operations, you'll see people in the hazmat suits, right? Because this can be really, really damaging to your health, even as you're trying to save the item itself. Mold is notoriously difficult to treat. Fun fact, it is almost impossible to kill. You can only denature it. There's active mold and denatured mold. Active mold is this squishy, furry, moist kind of patches that you see on books. Dormant mold is that dry dust that you see sometimes, usually black, in the ditches of books. So prevention is really the key for this, because again, once you get mold on a piece of artwork or a photograph or a book or anything like that, you're pretty much going to be fighting it for the rest of the lifespan of that item. So prevention really is the key. If you do get it, quarantine immediately so it doesn't spread to other items in your collection, but you never want to seal up anything. Basically sealing, sometimes you'll say, well, I have this book that's moldy, I want to quarantine it, I'll put it in a Ziploc bag and put it, away. You've just created a micro environment that thing is just going to circulate and circulate and circulate and get worse and worse. If you do discover a book that has dry or dormant mold, you can use a fine brush to try to get some of those spores out of the book, but again, be very, very careful. Face mask is probably the best thing to do for that. And also, I should say here as well, don't dust the book in the direction of other books, because you're just spreading it around at that point. Hydrogen peroxide, gently applied with a Q-tip, is probably the best thing to do to denature active mold. So if you have mold that's kind of around the edges of a water patch or something like that, you can use that to speed up the denaturing process so it doesn't spread and spread and spread. I said before that UV light and sunlight were really, really damaging to items, and they are. They're also really damaging to mold. So limited exposure to UV or sunlight is a great way to treat mold if you don't expose it for too long. If the book is still wet, or the item is still wet, I should say, air circulation is a great way to dry it out, but like I said before, be careful where it's circulating to. If you're trying to treat it in the same room that your collection is housed in, not a great idea. My favorite option when it comes to mold is what I call the gamma ray option. I said before that it's almost impossible to kill mold. You can kill mold with gamma rays. In all of the jobs that I've had in my professional career, none of my directors will buy me a gamma ray emitter, which I'm very disappointed in because I can't conduct my gamma ray experiment. Maybe one day, we'll see. Okay, basic organization and safe storage. A lot of you are probably doing this stuff already. Like I said before, cool and dry environment, minimal light exposure. Those are very, very easy things to accomplish. Acid-free boxes and archival polyester, otherwise known as Mylar. It used to be a real treasure hunt to find these things, but now hobby stores, the Gaylord company does a lot of this archival quality stuff, a lot more accessible than they used to be. Rule of thumb, anything that's archival, anything that's acid-free is generally going to be the way to go. Basic plastic that you get in an office supply store, probably not going to be your best bet. Oversized materials or things that have folds in them. You mentioned the letters before, that's a good example. Also collections of newspapers. You don't want to store anything that has the fold on them because that crease is just going to get more and more pronounced and it's going to split. So if all possible, if you have large materials, things that have folds in them, do your best to store them flat as much as you can. I mentioned this before, but you never want to laminate completely or seal anything because you're creating a micro environment Folders and encapsulations are fine, but you always want to leave at least one corner open for air circulation and things like that. For photographs in particular, there's something called the photographic activity test, and it's a measurement of material. It basically measures how much of the UV spectrum it filters out before it damages your item. So with material that you're going to be using to store photographs or any sort of visual image, if you look for the photographic activity test seal or something like that, that's a good way to...
Should it say? Like if you buy an album that you want to put pictures in and label, what should that album say? I mean,
so what you want to look for. So what you'll want to look for is either it'll say archival, acid-free, or in some cases it'll say PAT certified or photographic activity test certified or something like that. That's probably going to be a lot less common to see that, but if you do find it, that's a test specifically for the safety of that material. Yes?
I have been laminating obituaries. Should I not do that?
Yeah, it's probably not great to do lamination because the material itself is probably not acid-free, and again, you're sealing something into its own environment.
Well, all of my old ones from like 80 years ago have turned yellow, and you can hardly read them. So that's when I started laminating them.
Okay. So it's definitely an option, but it's not one that I would recommend for long-term storage. This is newsprint. Is that what you're talking about? Yeah, newsprint is rough because newspaper printing was never really meant to last, and so in that case, I would probably treat it like a photograph in the sense of trying to mount it on acid-free boards with archival quality mylar over the top of it, rather than trying to seal it in a lamination.
You can't unlaminate them though, can you?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, how long will that last?
How long will a lamination last?
Yeah.
I don't know.
So maybe your descendants can worry about it.
I guess they'll have to, because
Yeah,
I've laminated a lot of them so far.
Yeah, that's that idea of non-permanence.
Should I make a copy of them first?
Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit.
Laminate them?
Yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit about digital options when it comes to preservation. That would probably be the best bet in terms of if the original is fragile enough that it's no matter what you do, it's not going to last, no matter what high-tech solutions you apply to it. If it's still not going to last, then your best option is to make a copy, essentially. A digital copy or a high-quality facsimile or something like that. So that would probably be the next step that I would recommend.
How do you give the copy? How do you preserve the copy?
Make another copy?
Acid-free.
There you
Yeah,
go.
I mean, once
Put it in
if you make a copy of something and the original is gone, then that copy is the original essentially, and you treat it just like you would the original. So.
Well, I've been writing our ancestry book, and so I've been laminating a lot of things.
Okay.
I want pictures.
Okay.
But I do the obituaries.
Okay. Yeah, I would say digitization and making other physical copies of would probably be the next step that I would recommend. So, and then photo albums. This is a thing specifically to photo albums. If you can store albums intact rather than trying to separate the photos, unless there's something really, really bad going on with the album itself, it's usually best to try to keep it all intact together. All right, digital preservation. So, digital preservation, it's a tool in your toolkit. It is not the one-size-fits-all solution to everything. When I was in library school, there was a group of my fellow students who thought that it was the solution to everything, right? We don't need the originals, we've got the digital, I can just pull it up on my phone or I can pull it up online. Pretty short-sighted in my opinion, but digital preservation does have a role to play in preserving items. For one thing, long-term accessibility, in theory at least. Again, like I said, if the original disintegrates, if the original is no longer accessible, at least you have something that can be accessed in the long term. And of course, it's wide-ranging as well. I don't have to actually visit the Gutenberg Bible to see the Gutenberg Bible. In some sense, I can pull up images, I can see what the object is all about from a distance. And like I said, it's a tool to use in combination with other preservation techniques. So I mentioned a minute ago, the advantages are it makes backups, so you can create a copy of something that is really on its last legs, and you can duplicate that backup as well. It can be a really valuable tool for organization and curation if you want to create a specific photo album that's digital. It's easy to rearrange and to curate a digital archive. And then of course access, right? You can turn it into a format that anybody all over the world can open.
When you talk about digital preservation on your iPhone, what are you talking about? What kind of digital preservation?
So
Yeah.
it can run the gamut from doing high quality recordings of, like if you have a cassette tape that you want to make a recording of, you can make a high definition recording of that. If you've got a particular book that you need high quality, high resolution scans of, there are particular book imaging, like you lay out the book and it's got a high powered camera on top and you just take high quality photos of the book.
So this is something you can't really do just with your iPhone.
Well, I mean, just taking a photograph of something is a form of digital preservation, but when you're talking about the really high quality professional level, what you really want to do for future generations, you're talking about, you know, thousands of megabytes in a single image, because
so it'd probably be better for a professional to take it to a professional. Is that what you're saying?
they can, but if you have a camera on your phone, this type of preservation is accessible to you just at a lower level. It's
So you can do this with your iPhone.
absolutely you can. The main problem is, and you alluded to this a moment ago, some of the unique dangers of digital preservation is it's not foolproof. I mean, if you have a server with where you store these images or you store these recordings or you store the video or anything like that, power outage, power surge, a fire in the building can affect those just as much as they can any other item in the collection. So it's not foolproof, even though you can duplicate it, even though you can store a massive amount of information digitally. It doesn't mean that it is safe from any of these other dangers. And accessibility can be complicated. You run into this sometimes if you're trying to do research on, or research like newspaper articles. A lot of newspapers have been digitized over the years, but you have to pay to access them. So it's not quite a case of, oh, there's digital copies, it's searchable, it's great, it's all accessible, but it's behind a wall somewhere. Somebody's put up a wall between you and it. So accessibility is not quite as clear-cut as it might be with some of these things. And then format obsolescence, right? What do you do with the copy? What do you do with this? My player won't play this anymore. One of the constant pitfalls of digital preservation is that there's always the next thing down the line. Computer scientists run into this a lot, where you'll have a program that was great 10 years ago and we want to keep running it, but we can't. There's no way to do it anymore. Same thing with preservation, right? You make a digital recording of an audio track and suddenly you can't play it anymore. What do you do with it? Well, you have it, it's still there, you made a backup, but then what? All right, so just real quickly, emergency preparedness and response. So these are not slow burns of destruction. These are the big events that you hear about. Fire, smoke, flood, and mold are kind of the 4 horsemen of destruction of collections. When you're talking about preparedness, it's if there's a fire in your house, there's a flood in your house, if there's some event, just like you would plan to protect yourself and your family safety-wise, have a plan in place to protect your collections. If you can only choose one thing to pull out of your collection if there's an emergency, what is it? So, vital records, health documents, anything financial related, and of course your historical and personal items. Know before something happens what is it that you're going to grab on the way out. My wife and I know exactly the books on our shelf that we're going to grab if there's ever a fire. After we get those, we'll go back for my son, and then our cat, and then all that kind of stuff, but we'll get those first. General tips, of course, safety first, right? You're more important than your items. Make sure you are safe before you go back for your photo album. But aside from that, the first 48 hours of any disaster are really the key. That's the make or break time when it comes to doing any kind of protection work or any kind of preventative measures for your items. That's really the time frame that you're working about. Typically, when it comes to emergencies, fire is the big one, but of course when they put the fire out in your house, everything else is going to get water damaged. So area drying in a cool environment, just like you would in a normal situation. Of course, preventing mold is a priority. The heat plus the water is going to mean mold is going to go run rampant. And then of course, restoration professionals, this is really the time to call them because this is stuff that is going to be outside of pretty much any of our...
Insurance company will pay for it.
There you go. Yeah. If that's the case, that would be great. I'm not sure.
I found that out.
Okay. And in case of fire, grab this and use the stairs. All right, well, thank you guys. If there's no more questions, the feedback forms, like I said before, I've got some ideas about more specific topics that I would like to get into with this, but I do want to hear from you guys because if there's certain things that we really need to delve into specific to photographs, for example, if you guys let me know that that's what you want to focus on, that way I can do the research and I can get all the information to answer your questions during those sessions. So please, if there's something specific you would like for me to talk about or have discussions about, please let me know. And then be on the lookout for the next session.